Okay, so I'm going to talk about the social impacts of climate change, and I'm going to take a really high-level view. And I was glad that I'm talking after Rashid, because Rashid always makes me very happy when he talks. And unfortunately, the social impacts of climate change is not a very happy story. It's a little bit of a bleak story, if you like, and I'll be drawing on that, those points that were already drawn out about the latitudes which are most impacted. So, let me see how I can work this. Yes. So I'm actually starting with the conclusion of this talk. Basically, there's three things that are really obvious, if you like. So, geographically, the social impacts of climate change will not be equally distributed. It's going to be unequal distribution. The livelihoods of people who live in already disadvantaged areas are going to be most impacted and become more disadvantaged. So what I'll do is I'll provide some evidence towards that, hopefully. And some groups in these already disadvantaged places will be disproportionately worse off. So not only are they in the areas that are already disadvantaged, some groups within that will be even more disadvantaged. So, in terms of the social impacts of climate change, this here is what is often referred to climate-related hazards. Now, the way that the social impacts are going to be felt is through these climate-related hazards in combination with other hazards. So, climate hazards are one of many things that can go wrong. These are going to impact on communities and the wider societies and individual people, mainly through what we call livelihoods. Now, livelihoods is a broad concept because it doesn't only include making a living to put food on the table. It's actually other things as well. It's the opportunities that you get in life to make a living, education, it's the assets that you have to make a living, the capabilities that you get to do that, is what we refer to as livelihoods. So the livelihoods are, with the IPCC report says there's high confidence in the fact that livelihoods will be impacted by climate change. Now I'll be talking about some of these impacts here. I'll be talking a little bit about food security, poverty, health, conflict and migration, because they're sort of issues that have been in the news quite a bit, and I just want to shed some light on that because I can't cover everything. But hopefully throughout the next week we'll get to all the other points as well. So, coming back to catches, so this is the supply of fish around the world. This graph here shows the change in catch predicted to between now and 2060. So this shows clearly that the change in catches, and I know there's been some debate about this already, about the top here, etc. But as Rashid and others have already indicated, the lower latitudes are the places where this impact is going to be felt. Now, at these lower latitudes, it's also the place where most of the low-income countries are. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So, thinking about low-income countries, in a lot of these, which is Africa and Asia in this graph, if you think about reliance on fish protein as a part of your diet, in places where the total animal protein intake in grams per person per day is low, which is to the left of this, of the y-axis, this is where your total animal protein intake is low. It also happens to be the share of fish in this animal protein is high, which is on this end of the graph. So places with low animal protein intake happen to have a high reliance on fish for this small amount of animal protein intake in Africa and Asia. That's India there and that's China there. The size of the bubble is the size of the population. So as you can see, in places where they're challenged to get their own animal protein, they're actually really reliant on fish to get it. So if you think about global average, we eat about 300 grams per person per week, which is about 45 grams per day. In Japan, which has the highest consumption per capita of fish, it's about 150 grams per day. Now if you look at a place like India, it's not even 12 grams per day, but you have to remember that India is a largely vegetarian country, so these numbers are a little bit deceptive. But the point to take away here is that reliance on fish in low-income countries is very high for your animal protein. So that's the fish side of the story, right? So we have high impact in low-income countries where they're very reliant on fish. We also have impacts on land, and as Beth already said, at the moment they're trying to combine these impacts on land with impacts on the water. This is a map showing the estimated impact of temperature increase on yields in agriculture, crop yields in agriculture. And again, you can see that the impact around the equator is high, but also in the southern hemisphere. And I would like to point out in Brazil here, the impacts of changes in crop production under temperature increases is high. So it's, in this graph you can see the southern hemisphere and the equatorial regions are going to be mostly impacted by reduced crop productivity. So if you put those two together, you can come up with a measure of vulnerability to food insecurity, food from the sea and food from the land. So if this is the, if this is the present day, you can see that the red colours are the countries that are very vulnerable to food insecurity. In 2080, the predictions are that these countries that are already vulnerable are obviously going to become even more vulnerable. So again, the picture is not good for the lower latitudes. So low income, food insecurity and poverty. Poverty is really important. In the IPCC report, it says that poverty is the most serious obstacle to effective adaptation to climate change. This graph here shows that this is actually the highest income, the dark reds, and as you can see, the dark reds and the dark reds here are basically the inverse. So high food insecurity, high poverty. Again, it's not a happy story, and I'm sorry about that. So poverty is often, by economists particularly, is mentioned in terms of income per day. Now, the international poverty line is $1.25 per day. There's about 1 billion people in the world that are living under the $1 a day, $1.25 a day poverty line. There's about another billion that live between $1.25 and $2 per day. So this graph here shows that that's one aspect of poverty, but poverty is multidimensional. Poverty can also be measured in terms of the opportunities that you get, the literacy rates, the access to health systems, and credit and legal services. This graph basically shows that if you're a low-income country and you're high on the poverty line in terms of income per day, percentage of the population that's low on income per day is also high in terms of the other dimensions of poverty. So poverty is, as I said, multidimensional. You can be poor in many, many ways. So, just summarising so far, basically, as we saw, the lower latitude countries are most at risk of food insecurity, both in terms of things that come out of the sea and things that come off the land. And the livelihoods of people who live in these already disadvantaged places suffer from the multidimensional poverty, which places the biggest obstacle to adaptation to climate change. Okay, so within that, in my first slide I said I would also talk about the groups within these disadvantaged places that are even more disadvantaged. So these are the ones that are mentioned in the IPCC report as groups of people who are more disadvantaged in comparison. So women, for instance, are more disadvantaged. If you think about the women for instance, in Africa, they do a lot of the work out on the land. So if you can think about increasing temperatures and heat rises and heat stress, the women are going to suffer a lot. And that's just one example. You can also think about, in terms of flooding. After flooding events, the men often go off to work somewhere else and leave the women to do all the tasks. So they carry a lot of the burden after extreme events as well. Indigenous people are also mentioned as being highly at risk of inequality in terms of climate change impact. Indigenous people are said to be really good at adapting to climate change, but they're not good at adapting to, for instance, globalisation and economic pressures. So in terms of Indigenous, but if you think about Indigenous people in the Arctic, they'll be sort of disadvantaged through loss of their cultural access areas, etc. So and often Indigenous people have no direct say in the governance system, so often they don't have a voice, so they're disadvantaged like that. So also children and older people, and they're mainly through health impacts, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then people in the rural drylands area, they're often talked about because in cases of droughts, they are displaced. And recently I was at a workshop in Madagascar, and something interesting that I found out there is when there's a drought, the people will move to the coast to go and catch fish to eat, basically, because they have to, because there has nothing, they haven't got any crops. So what happens when they go to the coast is that there's already people who are culturally, they call them fishing people, they live on the coast and they live off fishing. So all of a sudden all these people from the dryland areas go to the coast to go fishing and compete for the fish with the people who are traditionally fishers. It causes big conflict. And also the people who are the fishers say, these people from the drylands, they don't know how to fish. They use dynamite and methods to go fishing that these other people who do it sustainably don't do. So it creates even more conflict. And so in Madagascar they go to the coast, but what often happens with people who are displaced from the rural drylands is they go to the urban areas, as most of you will know. And then when they're in the urban areas, they'll usually end up being migrants into these areas and being living in poor areas. So they cluster together in poor areas. So basically they become disadvantaged in the urban areas. And that's not only exclusively in the low-income countries, but also in the middle-income countries. And there's a lot of empirical evidence available for the disadvantaged groups here. So just talking about flooding a little bit, because that's sort of relevant to the urban areas, particularly the urban poor as they call them. So the urban poor are disproportionately affected, but if you look at this, you can't read this, but basically what it says here is the world's megacities that are below the line, what they call it. So they're below they will be affected by sea level rise. So often what happens is that the poor people in these urban areas live in low-lying areas, and they will be the first to be affected by flooding events. And that's a lot of people. There's some big cities in there. So this graph here shows you the sea level rise predictions in the different areas, and the Pacific is particularly affected here. So moving from sea level rise to health impacts, and we haven't talked at all about the health impacts of climate change. There's some important ocean-related health impacts, and in fact there was a paper in PNAS yesterday or the day before that talked about the ocean-related, I think it was Vibrio, and the diseases that were increasing from the increasing Vibrio outbreaks, which are temperature-related, really clearly temperature-related. So in terms of health impacts, you can have direct mortality. Basically, if you have an extreme event, people will drown, etc. And in particular, children and older people will drown. So these are the groups that are often disadvantaged. You can have indirect impacts, vector-borne health effects. So malaria and diarrhea, which is obviously related to some of these cholera outbreaks, etc., temperature-related as well. And there's a huge number of people that are currently affected by those two diseases. And then you can have health impacts through the undernutrition through the societal system. So just some empirical examples of those effects. So here we have a study in Peru that shows the relationship between diarrhea, which is a big killer. It sounds sort of innocent, but it's a big killer of children, particularly. So for every 1 degree temperature increase, there's an 8% increase in diarrhea incidences. This is the deaths during a heat wave in Paris. And you can see that the deaths at the peak of the temperatures are much higher than at the lower temperatures. Just some empirical evidence of the health impacts of climate change. And again, elderly and young people are affected by this. And this is just a graph showing the predicted increases in malaria incidences to 2080. So the World Health Organization expects that there'll be another 250 additional climate-related deaths per year from the different things between 2030 and 2050. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you of the fact that some of these groups are disproportionately affected from climate change, so that's some of the social impacts, and they're particularly women, elderly, children, Indigenous people, rural, dryland and poor people. So some things that are being often talked about now is conflict and migration, and the two are related, and the impact of climate change on those two. Now there's a lot of science, but there's a lot of difference of opinion about these relationships. And so I just wanted to point out that the IPCC lists 3 main climate change effects that could potentially increase the incidence of conflict, whether that's within a nation or between nations. So these are increasing scarcity, and Rashid already mentioned fish wars, so there's already incidences where fish are moving somewhere else and it's creating conflict. Obviously, if you have failed crops and people move somewhere else, it creates conflict. So the conflict over increasing scarcity and variability in natural resources is expected to increase the potential for a conflict, especially in the sub-Saharan countries. Sea level rise, again related to displacement of people, and the intensification of natural disasters. But as I said, there's a lot of contention about this because economic welfare is the single and most consistent factor that explains conflict incidents. So climate change will add to that, but it won't be the only thing. It's in combination with everything else. And in fact, there's also a lot of evidence that's gathering that these natural disasters, particularly extreme events, don't actually lead to conflict, but they lead to increasing cooperation between people. So in Australia, for instance, there's been a lot of fires that are linked to the high temperatures, and after a massive fire with a lot of destruction, people actually band together and cooperate rather than have conflict. However, in the low-income countries that I've already pointed out, that were highly dependent on fish and that were vulnerable to food insecurity, a lot of these countries are conflict prone and may be unable to cope with this change. So if you look at this graph here, this is the Human Development Index that was already mentioned, and there's also such a thing as a Government Effectiveness Index. The countries that are listed in red here are low-income conflict and post-conflict countries, and they all appear where there's a low governance index, as you can see. So if the government is ineffective and conflict-prone, they're on this graph down here. And these are said to be more vulnerable because they're poor and conflict leads to maladaptation or low levels of adaptation. So then to migration. Again, migration is also a thing that has been talked about being linked to climate change. Again, there's a little bit of difference of opinion in the literature about, because it's difficult to isolate it from other, what they call push factors. So economic factors that are pushing people out of countries to migrate, as we're all aware of the terrible stuff that's been happening all over the world. But there's general agreement that climate-related migration is happening and will increase. And in fact, Noam Chomsky was on social media or on the news in the States in the last couple of days saying that that's what will happen. And basically because they've lost their livelihoods or they move for safety reasons. So the literature also says that most people actually don't want to move when they're affected. They want to move back. So a lot of the response to climate variability is short-term. People move away and move back when they can. People want to generally be in their own countries. So in the Pacific, it's really clear that people don't want to move from the Pacific. They love the Pacific, they want to be there, they grow up there, it's their culture, etc. So migration, I just want to emphasise that migration is linked to climate change, but it's not, again, difficult to separate from all the other stuff that's going on. So I just found this graph recently, also, I think this was I can't remember who, the International Development Monitoring Centre put this graph out. This is just the last 7 years, up to 2014. This is the actual displacement of people caused by disasters, and some of these are weather-related and some of these are geophysical. As you can see, there's a huge amount. There's 42.4 million people who were displaced in 2010 by disasters. So obviously some of this is climate related or climate change related, so this is evidence that it's happening. So if you think about all these effects that I've talked about, and as I said, it's a difficult problem, and it's not easy to separate all these effects. Now think about global population increases that are predicted. The total population will reach about 11.2 billion in 2100. Almost all the growth of that increased population will take place in the developed world. The population of more developed regions will remain mostly unchanged at 1.2 billion. So these countries around here are going to be growing a lot. India is going to be the biggest country. It's going to be surpassing China. And in fact, Nigeria will be larger population than the USA in 2050, I think. Yeah. So that's the predictions. And these are the cities that are going to be the biggest cities in the world, right? In India, in Bangladesh, in Kinshasa, in Congo, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. So 42 million people in Mumbai and Dhaka, I mean, that's a pretty flood-prone area. So just have a think about that. At the moment, in 2025, Tokyo is the biggest and Sao Paulo is the 5th biggest. Sorry, it says 21 million, it's the 5th biggest city in 2025, according to predictions. So Brazil's up there. So knowing what we know about the impacts of climate change in the lower latitude countries, about poverty being multidimensional, about these disproportionately affected groups, what will this mean in terms of conflict and migration? Thinking about the population growth over the next 30, 50 years, it's going to be challenging, right? But no reason to be not optimistic, obviously. We have to be optimistic about it, but it's worth thinking about. Now, I actually stick these slides in as an afterthought because of what Laurent mentioned this morning about scenarios for global change. And I just wanted to, so they don't really fit with the rest of the talk very well, but I just stuck them in to give you a background on the shared socioeconomic pathways that the IPPC uses to define those scenarios. And it's only 3 slides, so if you bear with me, I'll just quickly explain to you what those things are based on. So basically there is such a thing as called future studies, and it's basically the science of doing scenarios. Now future studies are the studies of possible and probable and also or preferable futures. So there's a group called the Social Scenario Group, and they developed scenarios for world development in the 21st century based on what's called a worldview. Now what usually happens is that if you get 67 people like yourselves in a room and you ask people to think about what the future is going to be like, usually you'll get 4 different views. There's 4 different groups of people with 4 different views of what the future looks like. And these are just, and so basically the IPPC uses future studies to come up with these predicted scenarios for the future. So I'll go to the next slide, which probably explains it better. So as I said, there's usually 4 different worldviews that people have. People believe, for instance, that there's going to be something that resembles a world market. So there's local environmental policy, there's modest global environmental policy, and there's high economic growth. On the bottom axis is the socio-political dimension. So if you put it bluntly, the further to the right means that you're more left-wing. On the y-axis is an economic political dimension, so there's an increasing amount of laissez-faire, if you like, if you're going up this axis. So in the bottom right-hand corner here, it's all about ambitious local environmental policy, modest global environmental growth, and low economic growth. So people generally believe that the future is going to be in one of those domains if you get people to map out the future. So you have to think about, where does your worldview fit within those domains, right? You might be of the belief that we're going to have a local utopia. So we might need that low scenario prediction that that's what will happen in the future. Or you might believe that it's just going to be like laissez-faire, everyone is going to trade with everyone, everything's going to be open for everyone. What will that mean for carbon emissions? They will go through the roof, so we might be on the top one. So this is basically what the IPCC uses as the basis, and these are the 5 scenarios that the IPCC uses. In the middle, they have called it middle of the road, and they've basically mapped it in terms of socio-economic challenges for adaptation and socio-economic challenges for mitigation. So again, conventional development, sustainability, inequality. So it's also mapped according to economic predictions, but also social predictions. So people might work more together, will become a more sharing place or a less sharing place. There's different dimensions on this. But basically, the storylines behind these different shared socio-economic pathways explain some of the IPCC predictions in terms of global change. Did you want to add anything?
So those are the new SSPs.
Yeah.
And they don't map exactly with the RCPs. So the RCPs are just trajectories of relative forcing, if you want. So you can imagine now that you have a big matrix. On one axis it's the 5 SSPs, and then you have the RCPs on the other axis. And so you can't fill all the boxes of the matrix, because for example with the SSP5, you could do RCP 8.5, you could do RCP 6.0, depending on the intensity of the conventional development. You maybe could do RCP 4.5, but clearly the RCP 2.6 is not compatible with SSP5. So it's like you have storylines on one side of the matrix, and then the relative forcing on the other side. So we'll have potentially 5 times 4 times maybe more.
Thank you. Yes, that's a better explanation. So that's my last slide. So I just sort of stuck those 3 slides in on worldviews just to make you aware of the fact that we all think differently about how the world works and what might happen in the future. There is not one story. It all depends on where we come from, who we are, and what we believe. So, and as scientists, that's really important. We're not objective, right? Maybe we are. So my last slide is basically was supposed to go after the end of that, what's happening in terms of poverty and health, etc. And I wanted to pose the question here that we're trying to meet these 17 Sustainable Development Goals over the next little while. Now the first 5 over here, that's no poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education and gender equality. They're all things that are going to determine where we end up in terms of climate change and adaptation. We have to solve these problems at the same time, right? If we can't solve poverty, then the chance of adapting and dealing with climate change is going to be very difficult. So, that's, as I said, it's a little bit of a bleak picture about the social impacts of climate change, but it's just for us to debate over the next, 7 days to come back to this. That's all I have to say, and we'll move to Paul.